So if you're in the parish hall, let's see, does that? Good morning. If you're in the parish hall, please get some coffee and find a seat. And if you're watching from home, we'll get started in about 2 minutes. One, two, one, one, one. Does this mic work a bit better? It does, doesn't it? Yeah. I know you'll be back. Would you prefer to use a lavalier mic? Of course, you don't have a pocket to put it in, do you?
Yeah, I don't.
Okay, that's fine.
So I'll need to speak into this and then point.
Yes, and I can help you with that. So
Okay.
let's see. All right, we're back to this mic. Does this sound good? Okay. Welcome. I think that Cynthia Radding is the speaker who has traveled the furthest to be with us, because you may think that she just lives down the hill, but she actually lives in Mexico. So Cynthia is the Goosenhoven Distinguished Professor Emerita from the University of North Carolina, recently retired, and I am going to get a copy of her new book, Bountiful Deserts, for you to look at. And then I'm going to turn the mic over to Cynthia. Welcome home. And we're so pleased to have you here.
Boyk and I, good morning. Good morning and blessed
Justice for your
height. Yeah. Good morning and blessings on all of us on this day of St. Michael. And it's a joy to be here. Thank you so much, Boykin, for arranging this and for welcoming me back to Chapel of the Cross. I still consider this very much my church home, and I'm attending church in Mexico and really enjoying a new life of discovery and relationships and ongoing research projects in Mexico. So this morning I wanted to talk to you about the book that I published actually 2 years ago, Bountiful Deserts, Sustaining Indigenous Worlds in Northern New Spain. And what I want to do is print a little bit about the book and then about the kinds of relationships that I have developed with indigenous communities in Mexico in the course of writing the book and in the years following, and relationships which are continuing. And to talk a little bit about collaborative research, what that means, and how knowledge is produced and passed on from generation to generation, which is the theme of this year at Chapel of the Cross. So my talk is From Generation to Generation, Bountiful Deserts, Collaborative Research for Sustaining Indigenous Worlds through community institutions and traditional ecological knowledge. Research and writing Bountiful Deserts has brought me to a deeper understanding of the geographical and spiritual meanings of space, landscape, and people. The process has led to new discoveries in both unexpected and familiar places. It has shown me how to engage more fully in collaborative research, expanding the boundaries of the academy through the language and memories of current communities that sustain the wisdom of ancestral traditions in changing historical circumstances. The three main themes of Bountiful Deserts, which is in our church library, render the histories of the Yoreme peoples of northwestern Mexico through the enduring relationships between people and the natural environments they shape, their corridors of migration and geographies of settlement, and the production and dissemination of knowledge. Knowledge flows through experience, focused observation, and ritual ceremonies that are taught from one generation to the next. My presentation will summarize the book's main findings and narrative flow, and in the discussion that will follow, I hope we will explore together the co-creation of knowledge through different media and forms of documentation, and how this creation of knowledge relates to a spiritual relationship with nature and with one another. We gathered in the patio of a village elder in the small village of Los Nachuquis, the place of the Huachapori thorns. Under the shade of mesquite and piocha trees, we discussed the vital link between strengthening the Yoremnoki language among the contemporary Yoreme communities and the defense of what they call Luturia, their rightful claim to the forested spaces of the Monte, the spiritual world of the woodlands that they call Huya Anya, and the resources it provides. Several of the men and women present recalled their ancestors' legacy and the stories they told about the struggles to defend their land, their intersection with Mexican history. They affirmed that territory, what they call Itom Anya, or our world, signifies not only the land, but also the culture and the wisdom of the people. To speak of traditional ecological knowledge and environmental justice in the third decade of the 21st century opens a wide panoply of applications for these terms and their implications for politics, policy, environmental justice, and community identity. The meanings of traditional ecological knowledge extend to nature, understood as a material entity and as a cluster of natural rights, rights that accrue to rivers, to mountains, and to the peoples living with them. Traditional ecological knowledge also extends to justice in the sense of political rights to resources and their equitable distribution, and to community. Community refers to the social collective or the local polity of stakeholders who assert claims to territory and material resources, endowing them with both economic and cultural significance. Communities constitute the essential link to traditional knowledge, and they sustain practices of resilience in the face of climate change and in opposition to powerful interests for the commercialization of nature. Contemporary demands for traditional ecological knowledge and scholarly debates over its different meanings necessarily rest on a historical foundation of lived experiences, social memories, and environmental observations that are safeguarded in the community and transmitted across generations. Local knowledge itself evolves, and these historical pillars of knowledge and accumulated experience bring memories from the past to reflect on the multidimensional significance of environmental justice in our own time. The spatial and cultural creation of Itom Anya. Northwestern Mexico constituted a series of overlapping borderlands, radiating northward from the tropical environments of the Gran Nayar to the arid lands of the Sonoran Desert. What the Spaniards first called the land of reed houses, from the Nahuatl word, Petatlan, became a region defined by 4 major river valleys that flowed through the slopes and canyons to water the coastal plains leading from the Sierra to the Gulf of California. So these overlapping borderlands extend from south to north, from the tropical to arid lands, and also from the east, from the Cordillera of the Great Sierra Madre Occidental, westward and downslope to the coastal plains and then the Gulf of California. Native peoples created cultural landscapes through their labor, knowledge, and ceremonial cycles across different ecological zones, extending eastward from the Gulf of California through coastal beaches and brackish wetlands, networks of streams and floodplains, and the monte of thorn forest, cacti, and hardwood trees. Indigenous peoples defended these territories through their relationship to the life-giving monte, the source for hunting, gathering medicinal plants, fruits, seeds, and building materials, and for its spiritual power. The peoples of these 4 major river basins adapted Mesoamerican cultigens to these semi-arid but watered valleys, developing local varieties of maize, cucurbits, beans, chilies, amaranthus, cotton, and tobacco, as well as root crops like camotes, or what we would call sweet potatoes. Their combined practices of planting, harvesting, and gathering redistributed different species of herbaceous plants, succulents, and cacti. Furthermore, all the indigenous communities of the highlands and the river valleys both cultivated and gathered numerous varieties of edible and fibrous plants. The rivers and coastal mangroves and estuaries provided an abundance of marine life and freshwater fish, as well as salt. Indigenous peoples moved seasonally through different biomes to create a mixed livelihood of farming, foraging, and trade. Their landscapes were not timeless or unchanging, however, and their practices for planting, hunting, and foraging produced shifting borderlands. Indigenous skills for survival developed over centuries through experimentation, creating knowledge that was passed across the generations through quotidian practices, oral traditions, and rituals of dance and song. The colonial borderlands in Petatlan. Spanish colonialism came to the Gureme borderlands in the early 17th century through Jesuit missions and the mining industry. The Society of Jesus founded a network of mission districts extending through the river valleys of Petatlan in the provinces that became known under Spanish administration as Sinaloa, Ostimuri, and Sonora. In mid-century, the frontiers of mission evangelization, advancing northward from the Jesuit College of Sinaloa, met the mining frontier proceeding westward from Nueva Vizcaya, from the mountainous region of what today is Durango and Chihuahua. Mining began in Ostimuri with silver strikes in the 1660s, deep in the Sierra between the Yaqui and Mayo drainages. From the late 17th to the early 18th century, numerous silver mines and gold placers opened throughout the region. The parallel development of missions and reales de minas, or mining centers, created conflicts involving labor and resources. The mines and surrounding settlements became markets for mission produce and livestock, but at the same time, the missions became labor repositories for the mines. Workers were recruited on a rotational basis. They supplied the labor system known as repartimiento. This was obligatory labor, but it was paid labor. It was not chattel slavery. But these were rotational gangs of laborers that were taken from the mission pueblos to the mines and returned. However, parallel to these labor drafts, Indians traveled on their own to the mines incorporating paid labor into their patterns of seasonal migration. Over time, colonists and mission pueblos competed ever more rigorously for indigenous workers and the productive resources of croplands, pasturage, woodlands, and water sources in streams and springs. Jesuit missions were intended to bring scattered indigenous settlements into permanent villages, and they did this to a degree. But in practice, they became an interface between the rancherias, or small villages, that supported the Indians' seasonal movements through different biomes, and the ceremonial and political centers of mission pueblos. As the Spanish population grew, with the expansion of mining and livestock ranching, the institutional status of the missions under colonial law protected indigenous agricultural lands and portions of the monte, where native shepherds and cowhands tended mission herds of cattle. Yet mission lands were not necessarily contiguous or clearly defined, rather separate parcels of croplands, dependent on rainfall or the seasonal flow of intermittent streams, and grasslands mixed with thorn forest, were occupied at different times by both indigenous and Spanish cultivators, pastoralists, and foragers. These irregularly shaped stretches of monte often were named with indigenous toponyms, thus revealing locally recognized histories of occupation and use. And these names often combine the name of a plant and its closeness to a stream or its closeness to a hill. They're very pictorially descriptive of the landscape. Customary land tenure in these borderlands became institutionalized under the pressures of population growth and increased livestock herds. Over the course of the 18th century, colonial authorities pressured Spanish settlers to regularize their occupation of portions of the grasslands, woodlands, and scrub forest through a legal process involving the payment of royal fees to carry out the measurement, public auction, and issuance of title that turned open portions of the monte into discreetly bounded and privately owned properties. And many of the Spanish settlers were simply occupying land. And this process by which the Crown is trying to gain the revenues of imposing fees is what generates the documentation that allows us to reconstruct these changing patterns of land tenure. Private landholdings evolved from use rights, negotiated through verbal agreements, to demarcated entitled properties. The legal processes for enclosing portions of these woodlands contrasted with informal arrangements for sharing pasturage and water or transferring use rights through purchase and inheritance. Formal land ownership with measured boundaries and property markers ran counter to indigenous practices of land use and access based on the seasonal occupation of the monte and the resources of water, forests, and wildlife sheltered within it. The enclosure of the monte bears directly on the production of traditional ecological knowledge and its preservation and continued growth across generations. From the several hundred land titles and judicial disputes recorded in different archives, I have constructed a history of the dual process of land privatization through formal title and the defense of open space and the community institutions for their access and governance by indigenous peoples. To illustrate these processes, I bring to you today just one of these disputes involving the highland communities of Tepawi, Conicarit, and Macoyawi at the headwaters of the Mayo and Cedros rivers. Yeah, and they're actually on the next slide. These villages first entered the written historical record through 16th century expeditions led by Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, whom many people have heard of, in the 1540s, and Francisco de Ibarra in the 1560s. This second expedition left a very detailed chronicle about this region where Ibarra spent more time than did Coronado. Ibarra's chronicler described Tepawi as a memorable place along the mountainous trails leading through the Cedros Valley, passing, quote, beautiful riverbanks and arroyos with groves of cottonwoods, willows, and cedars. During the 17th century, Jesuit letters and reports took note of the Tepawis as having mounted armed resistance to Spanish military entradas, even as some of their leaders requested missionaries. Beginning in 1621, these highland villages consolidated into 3 mission pueblos. Conicare, that was the main village, meaning the crow's nest. Macoyawi, meaning where stone axes are heard, and Tepawi, the place of the fatted deer. We see many deer around here in Chapel Hill. Deer for many Mesoamerican peoples, and for the Patricio y Mas. And these were produced in the 1740s after a major revolt that had occurred in 1739 to 41. And the Jesuits were called to task to defend themselves as to what was going on in this region. And this report was particularly detailed on the trade relations that the missionaries saw were disadvantageous to the Indians, but also on the particular qualities of land and water across these 4 missions. And he included a map, and this is one of the wonderful things about working in the archives. In the map he says, aquí va un mapa mal pintado, si sirve. Here's a badly drawn map, if it will be helpful to you. But what he did show, as you can see, are these 4 river valleys. And he was showing the importance of the rivers, the estuaries on the Gulf Coast, and then his jagged lines, squiggly lines going across the top, indicating the mountain ranges. And this now is the document for the land dispute. In a legal battle that extended from 1791 to 1820, the Pueblo of Tepawi defended its long-standing possession of this piece of land, Bacusa, a stretch of land with sufficient water for agriculture, but it was some 2 leagues, that would be 4 or 8 kilometers north of their village. Faced with the threat of its measurement and conversion into private property in favor of a powerful miner and Spanish settler from the mining real of Barroquieca, the governor and the village council of Tepawi mobilized to demonstrate to local authorities their effective use of Bacusa. Governor Pedro Misqui and his fellow officers walked the land with the subdelegado, who is the Spanish administrator for this district of Ostimuri, to show him the milpas, that is, the fields they had cleared for planting, and the irrigation canals, the acequias, they had dug to carry water to their crops. The Tepawis harnessed the downward flow of streams and arroyos that fed into both the Cedro and Mayo river drainages to irrigate cleared fields in the lands immediately adjacent to their pueblo and in more distant places like Bacusa. Furthermore, the Tepawis maintained reciprocal relations with several Hispanic settlers from the small ranching settlement of Quiriego, lying upstream on the Cedros River. So these smaller Spanish settlers also used portions of the land, but they acknowledged in this document that the land belonged to the Pueblo of Tepawi. Despite the Tepawis' strenuous efforts, the intendant governor of Sonora and Sinaloa dismissed their arguments, referring disparagingly to their acequia as nothing more than a shallow ditch. In August 1791, he ordered the subdelegado to survey Bacusa in favor of Felix's bid to gain title to his land. Having summoned the neighboring landholders, including the Pueblo of Tepawi, and 2 other landholders, Francisco Javier de Valenzuela and the priest, Joaquin Elias Gonzalez de Sayas, they were both members of prominent families of the mining center of Alamos. The subdelegado began surveying the land in late October. When the measurements to the 4 cardinal points were completed, Governor Misqui and his fellow officers placed the boundary marker at the northern limits of Tepawi, separating their village lands from this portion of Bacusa that up to this point had been part of their territory. These instances of litigation over land and water illustrate the rich cultural fabric that informs environmental histories from below. The four communities of Conicari, Macoyawi, Tepawi, and Patacosa formed a network of interrelated families, languages, and mixed terrains of cropland and scrub forest that defined their identity in important ways. The evidence centered on the corporate polity and land claims of Tepawi highlights the ways in which these indigenous villagers intersected with the colonial economy and appealed to its legal institutions in the face of palpable, if gradual, transformations of their resource base. We'll turn now to histories of the present. Turning our view to the 20th and 21st centuries, it is clear that hydraulic technology has transformed the landscapes of the Mayo River Basin. Modernization accelerated beginning in the late 19th century in this whole region, from northern Sinaloa into southern Sonora, across these four river valleys that I presented. Modernization accelerated beginning in the late 19th century with large-scale surface irrigation combined with electricity, pumping of underground water, and the construction of canals, and clearing the monte to expand the areas of the floodplain dedicated to commercial agriculture. The Mexican Revolution brought agrarian form to the region, with parallel public policies to establish ejidos of small-scale indigenous and non-indigenous cultivators and to expand commercial production for economic growth and development. And these dual ambitions at times have come into conflict. Public investment in a series of dams along the Yaqui, Mayo, and Fuerte rivers changed the rhythms of stream flow and the replenishment of the floodplains irreversibly, with severe consequences for the knowledge base and agroecological practices of the Yureme peoples. Contemporary struggles over land and water, extending to territorial jurisdiction and local governance, take place in the mixed sociopolitical and economic matrices of commercial agribusiness and post-revolutionary ejidos, which are quasi-collective farming communities in which the individual families have use rights to land. And this was one of the keystones of agrarian reform following the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1920. Indigenous communities maintain the social memory from generation to generation and the deeply historical legacies of the missions and their religious traditions, their place names, and their ancestral ties to the monte. The contention over territory is rooted in the use of pooled resources under local governance, which is different from either unbridled private landholding or the open commons to be exploited without restraint. And this is one reason that I emphasize the existence of local indigenous assemblies and councils to regulate, to control, to reach consensus within these communities about the use of water, about their cultural traditions, and about their language. These principles are expressed eloquently by leading members of Yureme communities centered on communal assemblies and ritual centers in Corimpo, Tesia, Camoa, and Masiacawi. United under the figure of the Yureme Alliance, men and women who are recognized as community elders, as well as school teachers and university students, carry on the struggle for environmental justice and the defense of traditional ecological knowledge, centered on the recognition of their territorial lands and waters. They continue to raise their demands to the Federal National Institute of Indigenous Pueblos, the state government of Sonora, and through the National Indigenous Congress during numerous public hearings. In addition, they bring their story and their traditional knowledge base to academic forums through the National Institute of Anthropology, Centers for Anthropological Research, state universities, and technological institutes in Sonora and Sinaloa. They express the values they uphold through traditional ecological knowledge in their proposal to create a nature reserve to harvest water and recover traditional plants, and an open-air university to put into practice traditional ecological knowledge related closely to the Yoramnoki language and the celebration of rituals that define what it means to be Yoreme. These goals highlight the urgent challenge of recording the wisdom of the elders, creating audio and audiovisual digital recordings, using appropriate technologies to create archives that are at once enduring and accessible to the youth and adults of scattered rural communities and urban barrios, creating materials in the indigenous languages, and opening spaces for community participation in the midst of pressing quotidian economic needs. What then is our role as historians, anthropologists, ecologists, other academically trained scholars, and citizens like ourselves who have made a commitment to accompany the indigenous communities in their struggle? As many of us who are gathered here are doing, we listen, observe, visit the communities as often as we can and when we are invited, apply for funding, and learn from them, our allies and colleagues. In addition, we work together in research, outreach, and publishing. In the process, our academic traditions are challenged and enriched. For my part, I have not eschewed archival research. Rather, I have tried to use my talents and my training as an historian to weave together the insights from historical documents with contemporary experience in the field. I refer to the texts themselves, the vocabularies drawn from the Spanish and Yoramnoki languages, and the geographies of 2 centuries past that can be either superimposed or contrasted with the technological transformations and the ecological continuities across different time periods and fragmented spaces that still adhere to the territories of Itom Anya, our world. The wisdom of Coarimpo. Epistemology and cosmology, knowledge and faith, bring together the principles of territory, good governance, and living with nature in the book written by 7 elders of Coarimpo, published a decade ago under the title of A Thorn is a Forest of Lessons, or in Spanish, Una espina es un bosque de advertencias, Puepo Huicha, Seino Aniata Nuca. Compiled from conversations carried out in both Yoramnoki and Spanish, the book was organized into thematic sections and translated into Spanish for its publication with the objective of reaching a wide audience. 2 years ago, in 2022, as part of a renewed emphasis on Yoramnoki as the vehicle for conveying traditional knowledge and spiritual philosophy, 5 community members from different generations of elders and youth selected passages from the book to translate them into Yoramnoki. With the support of the Americas Research Network and Mexico's National Institute of Indigenous Pueblos radio station for this region, they produced texts and audio recordings of the passages that were especially meaningful to them in their language. I share one of them with you now. How do we get to the recording? This is the voice of one of the university students. It's in slide 19. If you can click on that at the top.
I'll just step out of the
an attitude of dealing generously with the people, respect for the generation of new life, the work of the councils, and good government.
Sorry, we can't. I don't know why that.
Okay. Visual language is also an important vehicle for transmitting knowledge. The complex layers of cultural engagement in the post-colonial domain of plural historical narratives finds expression in the artwork produced by Yureme students in response to their reading of passages from A Thorn is a Forest of Lessons. These are secondary school students who work with Mirna Valencia, who was one of the women in the photograph with whom I've been working closely. And we can interpret the drawings in many ways, but the one on our right is showing kind of the cosmos and a very outward-looking view of nature, and of the sky and the stars that are a part of what they consider to be their world, this Itom Anya. And the one on our left is somewhat more socially oriented to this idea of what it is to live in good relationship with the community and with nature. Finally, this weaving, produced several decades ago in the community of Masekawi, brings together community and nature. In closing, I share with you the interpretations of its symbolic meanings offered to me by two of my closest friends and collaborators in Coarimpo. Governor Don Remedios Aguilar Osuna Ontamocha wrote, "For me, the weaving represents our Yureme world from any vantage point. In it, we see the eye of God, as you can see in the center of the weaving, the four elements, wind, water, sun, and earth, what is distant and what is near, and the flourishing of the people. It is a classic design. The lines that you see running down the side of the weaving can represent lightning or thunder, also considered to be the sources of rain." Teacher and council member Mirna Dolores Valencia Banda, whom I just mentioned, also wrote the following in a more kind of internal, reflective, and meditative way of viewing this image. "In this weaving, I see total harmony. These symbols are in us as an intrinsic question of our being, manifested in the care, order, and symmetry that we apply to each action, like balance, equality, justice, and the other high moral values. All of this forms part of our world and our appropriate place in it. It is a question of probing more deeply into our self-knowledge." And so with this, I want to close and invite your reflections and questions and comments. Thank you very much.
We've just got about 5 minutes, but I can pass the mic if anyone has a question or comment.
Cynthia, as your study is in the archives and in history and everything, and the kind of the arc of the struggles of these people to the present, does it leave you, or do you feel optimistic or pessimistic about their future, about where this is going, if looking at, say, the trend from the past to the present?
It's an excellent question. I feel optimistic when I'm with them, in the sense that and a few of the pictures that I showed, their energy, the way they articulate their meaning of the territory, and the kinds of actions that they're carrying out. And so I feel optimism when I'm with them. When I think of the overarching tendency toward private profit, agribusiness, I become pessimistic. I may be very naive, but as you know, this coming Tuesday, Mexico's first woman president, a very, very accomplished person who has visited the Yaqui Valley and has reiterated the commitment of the outgoing president to justice for indigenous people. This, I think, is a good sign. Also, Mexico just passed 2 sets of important reforms, one of them to their judicial system, which was much commented on, I think, in the international press, and the other one, less taken into account in the United States, but also passed, is a reform to the second article of Mexico's Constitution, which strengthens the language, anyway, around the recognition of the autonomy of indigenous pueblos and their right to make decisions within the pueblos. So some of the challenge and some of the reasons for both optimism and pessimism is how these indigenous corporate entities can intersect with the legal framework of municipios, which would be like our counties and state governments.
My question isn't exactly about land use. It's more about ways of being, and in particular, in capturing the oral histories and the elder knowledge, how much of it is medical based in terms of the local healing, or I'm just thinking, I was in, I think it was Copan, and someone there was telling me how a fly would bury into their skin and how Western doctors would treat it with antibiotics. It wouldn't really work as well as the indigenous knowledge about plants that they use to heal. And so I'm curious how much medical knowledge is being captured.
Yeah, that's a large part of what they want to recover. And a theme that comes up over and over in terms of their worry and lament about losing access to tracts of this thorn scrub forest and, you know, what we consider to be arid land, but really has a great variety of plants in it, is precisely that. And one of the first conversations I had with some elderly gentlemen, one of them was the grandfather of Mirna, and I had brought a list of place names that I had found in the documents, and I was asking them for their meaning. And this led to conversations, of course, about the plants themselves. And they see the monte as their pharmacy. And yes, they do lament this very much. Now, they will work with Western doctors and Mexican institutions to a certain extent. Many of them were vaccinated against COVID and so forth. But they do have a whole different notion of sickness and health. And again, it's how do they keep their own beliefs about, as she said, symmetry, about balance, and they really, one of the things that she laments, and many of them lament and are trying to sort of defend against, is a dependence on store-bought food, a dependence on commercialized medicine, and lack of access to being able to produce their own food and to gather and produce their own medicines.
Here,
The colonial need to understand what they know in terms of applying it to our own situations, I guess.
Yeah, I think this is beginning. There's some of the Colegio de Sonora, some of the institutions, higher education institutions in the state of Sonora, for example, have carried out workshops on traditional medicine. And it's slowly working its way into Mexico's Social Security. There's a lot more that can be done there. And that's a challenge, but it's also an exciting place to begin or to continue working. Jackie?
let me give you the mic so you can be picked up for people at home.
Thank you. As I listened to the court case back in the 1700s, they had such a good case. I mean, they really presented it well. They have a great system. They explained it. They had all the representatives, and they weren't all native people. They were some people from the mission. I mean, there were people verifying it. And the governor said, right, and issued the grants. So these people have things going back way before 1700, but just dating it from there, that's a 300-year time since the governor said, nope, not doing it. How do you go back when you also now have people who say, no, this land with these borders has been in my family for 250 years by land grant, and it's recorded? How do you undo the damage that's been done for the last 300 years in discounting their whole system? Because our more Western system is built really on distinct borders. And I think you remember, because we were on the same bus in Ecuador when the lady was talking about the tribes that were integrated going up different levels, and all of the Westerners want to put a line around the reservation. It's just different than Western thinking. How are they going to be able to do what they ought to do for the indigenous people and still find a way to address somebody that's got a 250-year-old claim?
You know, you've put your finger on a very, very serious problem, and obviously legal land titles cannot be simply overturned. Now, for the case of the Yaqui Valley, which is just to the north, the outgoing president, Lopez Obrador, actually did return land to them, but there was the antecedent of the decree, the presidential decree in the 1930s that granted them an actual kind of bounded reserve. And what the Mexican government did was indemnify. They bought out some of the private landowners to return land. So what the Mayo communities are doing is trying to get recognition for some of the boundaries that they had drawn, and also really to get back water rights. And this is something that can be done without overturning a huge number of land grants and putting teeth into the law to remove much more recent occurrences of people who have just squatted on what is indigenous land. And thinking of ways of cultivating, this is one of the things that HECO talks about, ways of cultivating where you don't need huge acreage, through hydroponics, through greenhouse. There are ways of producing food where you don't need this huge extension of land.
So you're somewhat hopeful.
I'm somewhat hopeful.
Okay.
Well, let's end with some hope. Thank you so much. I know people need to get to the next service.
Yeah,
Thank
we
you,
have to get
thank you for
Thank you.
coming so far. When I said the theme was generation to generation, you said, "Oh, I've got it." Like, yes, you did.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Very good question. I think they had their own system, but there are some areas of Mexico where the Arabic system in Michoacan, in western Mexico, this has been documented. Well, no, not quite so much, but no, they had their own system, which was basically it's pretty primitive, building sort of diagonal earthen dams across a river stream that would raise the level of water, so it would then flow into the crops. Or into the plantations. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Oh.